Good morning. It's great to be here. Assalamu alaikum. I'm really excited to be in conversation with everybody. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and having me. I'm really excited to present, but even more excited to be in conversation with you all about the various topics encompassed by 9/11, the war on terror, as a domestic project in the United States, and that'll be the focus of my talk. But more specifically, as from a comparative lens with what's happening here in Canada, but also from a transnational angle. Vincent anchored the conversation, what's happening in East Turkestan with regard to the Uyghur genocide. I've been working on that specific issue, but also on global Islamophobia recently with a book that I'm publishing in the coming months. So my head is very much in the thick of what's happening on a global level with regard to the war on terror as a transnational project, but also with regard to the expansion of Islamophobia as a distinctly American crusade that is also metastasizing into, a panoply of very morbid crusades across the globe. So I was really struggling with how to approach this conversation this morning. Obviously, 9/11, the war on terror, with regard to the Arab and the Muslim American experience, is a very broad, vacuous, and expansive topic. So I really want to hone in on a couple of angles with regard to how to tackle this issue, and then hopefully, close the conversation with a broad snapshot of what the architecture of Islamophobia looks like in the United States and the implications this architecture has for how it's being exported on a global level. Before I transition into the more legal aspects of the conversation, I'll do a bit of, kind of personalizing why I do this work today and what led me toward a career in advocacy and academia, focusing in on the war on terror. So I am very much a product of the post 9/11 generation. My political perspective, my professional trajectory was entirely shaped by the events on 9/11, and specifically the events that took place after 9/11. I started law school. I was a 1L 2 weeks after the 9/11 terror attacks. I'd moved from Detroit right across the way, so it's kind of a surreal experience looking at my hometown while giving this speech, but perhaps also fitting. Moved to California, went to UCLA Law School specifically to study critical race theory, focusing in on how the law was used as an instrument to stratify, subjugate, and subordinate people of color in the United States. And not specifically knowing what it is I would do within that canon. Where would I find my space as a law student, as a lawyer, and at that time not knowing I'd be an academic down the line. But the events of that day really crystallized, a couple of things. The first thing was that the literature in critical race theory had not, at that juncture, sufficiently addressed the experience of Muslims on a grand scale, but also the experience of Arabs and Arab Americans in any way. And we all know that 9/11 by no means did not begin the racialization of Arab and Muslim Americans. It intensified it, right? It sort of conflated it with terrorism. But the seeds of racialization, if you will, had been firmly established well before 9/11. So all of our work is, basically built on the theoretical work of Edward Said. And, these words that he wrote in his autobiography, Out of Place, really resonated with me when I began to sort of track, a pathway within critical race theory, but also the law at large, as to where, I would find my footing within that canon. He wrote, "I am an Oriental writing back at the Orientalists who for so long have thrived upon our silence." And in the coming years, within academic scholarship, legal academic scholarship in the United States, you saw a burgeoning, if you will, a proliferation of scholarship addressing the Arab and Muslim American experience in ways that was unprecedented, obviously because of what was taking place in the United States at the time. You had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which was tasked with policing Muslims globally, Muslims domestically in the United States, which was tasked with overseeing the new federal agencies and the old federal agencies responsible for handling the immigration, for handling the new surveillance measures that were ushered in by the Patriot Act, by NSEERS, but also ancillary legislation that I'll talk about briefly. Law scholar Letty Volpe wrote that we are witnessing the redeployment of old Orientalist tropes, which really connected this new phenomenon of Islamophobia that was taking place in the post 9/11 moment with this, broader epistemology and this broader discourse of Orientalism that had existed decades and centuries before it. One thing to note is, at this time I was a law student. Even though you had a proliferation of scholarship and interest in Arab and Muslim Americans at the time, the vast majority of commentators writing about, Muslims as subjects and oftentimes as objects, from the left or from the right, were doing it from a space as external authors. There were very few Arab or Muslim scholars at the time within legal academia writing about the experience of Arab and Muslim Americans, Canadians, Europeans in real time. And I'll say this, that one of the first pieces that I read that really resonated with me as a law student was by Professor Reem Badi, who wrote a piece called No Exit: Racial Profiling in the Canadian War on Terror. And that piece read with a texture of familiarity and with, an insider's insight that, in many respects, and Professor Badi is very much a mentor to me today and a friend of mine. And that piece was very much one of the first pieces that I read that kind of functioned like a call to action, if you will, that I wanted to find my own way as a young Arab American lawyer, law student at that time, to eventually one day write about the experience of Arab and Muslim Americans within the legal literature. So it was really heartening to see her stand alone at that time as one of the very few Arab scholars writing about this subject. And now a generation later, I'm part of a burgeoning crop of American and Canadian law scholars writing about the subject. And I began to theorize Islamophobia when I began my legal career in academia roughly 10 years ago, grappling with what Islamophobia meant. And I published a series of academic articles in American law journals, grappling with what Islamophobia looked like and really struggling with how it was being defined at that time in the political and the popular discourses. Islamophobia, as a term, had not captured, kind of popular purchase in the United States. It, was being talked about in the British literatures and as early as the 90s. But it wasn't until the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, and then eventually the rise of Trump, where it became really pervasive and really prominent within the American political and academic discourses. But what we saw with Islamophobia was very much what Edward Said was talking about in his formative work, specifically Orientalism, that specifically in the political and the popular parlance, that you had this really sloppy conflation of specifically three distinct and standalone identities: Islam, obviously is a religion; Arab identity, which was racialized and politicized pre 9/11, but very intensely post 9/11, and then the region, the Middle East, which again they're all distinct, all standalone and separate, but they were all being sloppily conflated together as one sort of monolithic entity in the post 9/11 context, in ways in which various police agencies, federal and local, were surveilling Arab and Muslim communities in the United States, but also abroad. So even though we have this conflation, we know that Muslims and Arabs occupy a distinct array of intersections. I'm sorry, I'm this sort of like disconnected my presentation here in the slides. Distinct array of intersections. Arab identity obviously is a ethnic, political identity. Muslim identity is a religious identity. And building on the work of my mentor, Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined and theorized the term intersectionality, Arabs and Muslims obviously are distinct along religious lines, ethnic lines, political circumstance, geographic status. But regardless of these distinctions and this diversity, post 9/11 policy and post 9/11 discourses in the media and beyond were homogenizing who Arabs and Muslims were into a undistinguished monolithic whole. So as a consequence of the ways in which Islamophobia was being defined and framed in the political discourse and the popular discourse, and struggling with the ways in which it was being defined in the academic discourses, the academic discourse is largely focused on Islamophobia as being a form of animus, a form of bigotry that was being unleashed and that was being propagated by individual actors, hate mongers, bigots, people that were disconnected from the state. And as a consequence of that, I became really frustrated with the ways in which the political discourse and the academic literatures were disconnecting Islamophobia from what the state was doing. I thought that the state was the principal purveyor, the principal catalyst in propagating Islamophobia. So I set forth to define a new definition of Islamophobia. I wrote an article in the Columbia Law Review in 2015, where I advanced a new definition of Islamophobia, where I define it as the presumption that Islam is inherently violent, alien, and inassimilable, driven by the belief that expressions of Muslim identity are correlated to a propensity for terrorism. And this is the definition that I advance in the article. This is the definition that I adopt as my framework for the book. In Islamophobia, I delineate into three forms. You have structural Islamophobia, which was the form that was being neglected, again, in these various conversations that were happening within the political sphere and the academic sphere. Private Islamophobia, which the discourses tended to fixate on, hate crimes, hate incidents, again, propagated by individual actors. And then finally, I talk about Islamophobia being a dialectic, an ongoing communique between the state by way of its advancement of policy and law, and also the polity. And I can talk more about dialectical Islamophobia during the Q&A as to how that functions. So again, we know that Islamophobia is built upon this broader discourse of Orientalism. Again, this binary where Western actors largely define themselves in mirror opposite terms of the Muslim world, and individuals who are, said to be connected to that world, even though they might be citizens or residents of the United States or Canada. So Orientalism very much is the mother of Islamophobia in terms of its epistemological contours, but also its legal contours, which I'll discuss briefly. One thing to mention about private Islamophobia, which is distinct from structural Islamophobia, is we know that a wide range of the victims, specifically the first victims that were attacked in the immediate wake of the 9/11 terror attacks, were in fact not Muslims, right? You had Sikh men and women, you had Arab Christians across the United States, you had Latinos, you had South Asian Hindus and so forth, individuals who fit this sort of like imagined racialized caricature of who these hate mongers thought to be Muslims. Again, this shows the overpowering weight of this racialized caricature of Muslim identity in the immediate wake of the 9/11 moment, and the way in which it sort of mobilized hate mongers and vigilantes, if you will, acting on behalf of seeking revenge or vengeance on the part of the state, thought about Muslim identity, even though obviously it didn't align with the realities as to who Muslims were. But more important, I thought, and this is the sort of central contribution I seek to make in my work, first this article in the Columbia Law Review, and then my book, was that it's critically important to think about Islamophobia in systematic terms. The fact that it's an institutionalized sort of project that's advanced, again, by a whole range of state action, whether it be federal policy, whether it be local, state, and municipal policy, whether it be global wars. So it's critical to think about the legal architecture of Islamophobia as being a project or a network of laws and policies that are premised upon this baseline, right? This presumption that expressions of Muslim identity are in some ways correlated to a propensity or proclivity for terrorism. And in the United States, we see how this legal architecture is set up, right? Initially, you had not only the enactment of policy, but the entire revision and reformation of how government handles its policing and immigration function, as manifested by the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. But in addition to that, you had policies like the Patriot Act, which enabled strident sweeping surveillance. Strident and sweeping surveillance on Arab and Muslim communities infringing on a whole host of First Amendment civil liberties, including the free exercise of religion, speech, association, and so on, privacy rights as well. You had NSEERS, which functioned as a Arab and Muslim registry. So you might recall that Donald Trump, my former president, unfortunately, talked about enacting a Muslim registry. That was already in place well before Donald Trump proposed a registry when he was running for office in 2015. A whole range of other policies, counter-radicalization, policing as well, which was mentioned by my colleague earlier on, which I find to be the most nefarious form of structural Islamophobia. So I'll close on this note. I'm really excited again to engage in a Q&A. One thing that really mystified me when I was doing this work really early on, and that I really struggled with, even amongst liberal or progressive academics within legal institutions across the United States, is this pensioner fixation to frame Islamophobia as a distinctly conservative Republican phenomenon, right? Which very much isn't the case. In my country, the United States, every administration, Republican, Democratic, has advanced Islamophobia and has advanced the war on terror in its most distinct way. So I'll close with this, that counter-radicalization policing, which I'm happy to discuss more closely during the Q&A, I find to be the most nefarious form of structural Islamophobia, because it was distinct in the ways in which President Obama, in the way he configured the FBI, working closely with local law enforcement, was able to seed informants and was able to mobilize local law enforcement, right, to delve deep into the very heart of Muslim communities and Arab communities, whether it be mosques, whether it be community centers, whether it be Muslim student associations, to keep tabs not only on individuals that were suspected of terrorism, but in the professor's words, in very many respects, many of the cases that I read make terrorists out of thin air. So I'll stop there, and I'm really excited for the Q&A. Thank you so much.